Good morning, Spurgler. Did I wake you?
A Handbook for Right-Wing Youth was a book written by Julius Evola, outlining the ideal that Trial of Air is a foundational essay in that book for Western civilization. This is my third video on an essay from that book, but I swear it's worth it. This video will not only cover that essay, but also some history of the Serbian irredentist movement before World War I. In our daily lives, we are used to fixed objects or social rules which give us something unyielding to hold on to. This is also true in political life. There are forces that have existed for so long that we don't question their existence. It is just assumed that liberalism or socialism will always exist, or that there will always be certain parties like conservatives and liberals. As someone born in the 21st century, this is my frame of reference, as it is for even insanely old dinosaur people who were born in 1995. Even certain structures which may be arrayed against us also give us support. Our enemies give us a way to perceive ourselves almost by way of contrast. Los Angeles and San Francisco are centers of power that are generally left-wing, but if Hollywood or big tech were shattered, it would cause issues on the right, just as it would cause issues on the left. The left wing is an eternal enemy that many rightoids would not be able to do without, because fighting it gives them meaning and purpose. In the original essay, Evola was criticizing the Italian social movement, the spiritual successor to the fascist party. The ISM had many of the same problems as the dissident right today, and as this video is dedicated to a modern audience and not Italians living in the 1950s, I will comment on the dissident right, not the ISM. The term reactionary does not have a complicated origin. Socialists and liberals view themselves as an unstoppable spirit of progress. Reactionary is applied to anyone opposing them. Reactionary is a derogatory label, but it can be applied accurately to most of the right wing today. Most of the time and energy of conservatives, especially the ignorant and useless so-called center-right, is spent reacting to whatever the left does. The first 8 most popular videos on Ben Shapiro's channel are all in reaction to leftists. The first 27 videos on Steven Crowder's channel are either debunking or debating leftists, and the count stops at 27 because it's interrupted by an advertisement for Steven Crowder's Mug Club. It continues from there. Academic Agent used to run free weekly live streams. Of the free, by far the most popular one was where he and other guests react to the news. Carl Ghosn of Swindon's most famous series, This Week in Stupid, was just reacting to the left. This is just on YouTube. On Zitter, the most popular accounts like Annie No and Radio Genoa and Lives of TikTok and Patrick Casey just see things like, wow, look at this. Lips make me want to pull out all of my teeth. Lips make me want to have Roman soldiers drive spikes into my wrists and suspend me on a cross, or something like that. Most of the forces of the right are mobilized in reaction to the enemy. Mega cultists and populists and even Christian nationalists find their reason for being in the enemy and are activated by them. Polemics and inane babble are what take up rightoid mental space. Polemics aren't useless. They can be fun and encourage discourse, but conservatards babbling against the issue of trans rights wasn't what made the regime put that issue away between 2023 and 2024. Instead, it was put away by the billionaire cabal that runs the Republican entity otherwise known as America because it was extremely unpopular. You can say that it was unpopular due to right-wing pundits making polemics, but that is only relevant in the context of pre-existing sentiments being utilized effectively and not the right wing planting the seeds of something that would advance interests that would otherwise be unpopular. By contrast, the majority of Westerners have a positive predisposition towards abortion, but the pro-life movement successfully advocates against it in spite of that. Most of the time, the right meets the left where it is. If the more extreme elements of the left were to disappear, a lot of the right would be deactivated. The majority of this script was written in April 2024. That is to say, before the 2024 presidential campaign. But since I have come back to cannibalize my earlier writings, I can easily point to what has happened. Social justice warriors, libertarian socialists, and Antifa have practically disappeared. Consequently, millions of rightoids have been transformed from extreme skeptics of the government into unconditional supporters of the new occupation regime inaugurated on January 20th, 2025, Even though it is the exact same regime as before, the left disappeared and the right was unable to define itself without the presence of the eternal enemy. Their entire reason for existing was to obsessively use social media to get angry. Someone like Patrick Casey might say, and I'm paraphrasing,
"You're addicted to losing. The Trump government is good on border control, and I also eat grubs off the forest floor."
But there is even an issue with placing victories on specific issues like border control. The tyrants running the United States compromised on border control, but because the right wing has no coherent plan or comprehensive vision, they take this simple victory and are satisfied. The great majority of the United Station right wing have now been pacified by recent concessions made by the regime. Let's imagine for just a solitary, singular second that all of the oppressive power structures that currently exist should suddenly fall, that all laws aimed at ethnic cleansing were revoked, that all censorship was redressed, that our oppressors were henceforth incapable of using force to maintain power. And so, in other words, let us suppose that, from tomorrow, an all clear were issued. What would happen? Would we witness a sudden surge and takeover by the dissident right? Or is it rather the case that some commentators and activists would undergo a crisis, while others would remain speechless? For those who would undergo a crisis or remain speechless, their problem is that where a doctrine and a central idea should be is a black, empty void. The trial of air means being able to establish yourself in a vacuum when there's no frame, nothing to support yourself against. For example, and this is not at all comprehensive, Imperial Russia's goal as the Third Rome was to retake Constantinople. The goal of the Natsaks was to push to the Urals and create an empire that will last 1,000 years. What I'll be focusing on in this so-called video essay is the dream of Yugoslav nationalists to create a united South Slavic state. The proponents of Yugoslavia had one very strong positive vision, the creation of Yugoslavia. But this vision wasn't obvious at the beginning. It needed to be elaborated on as a coherent mission, and a doctrine needed to be created to complete this mission. There was a generation of Yugoslav writers and statesmen that preceded the creation of Yugoslavia. They had enemies in the form of the Turks, Austrians, Albanians, and sometimes the Italians and Bulgarians, but if their enemies were all to disappear, they would still have a real conception of themselves outside of just being anti-Turkish or anti-Austrian. In fact, that is actually what later happened as Austria-Hungary and the Ottomans were defeated and Yugoslavia was established. However, there wasn't complete unity among them. They were divided into two camps, the all-Yugoslavs, who wanted to integrate all South Slavs into an equal union with the Serbs, and the greater Serbian nationalists, who saw Croats, Bosnians, and Macedonians as Serbs who just needed education. Lubomir S. Jovanovic was one of those idealistic and humanitarian all-Yugoslavs, and he played a vital role in leading that faction. In 1903, at the Velika Škola in Belgrade, Jovanovic created Slovenski Jug, a student group. Slovenski Jug began publishing its own newspaper, which advocated for an all-Yugoslav unification. Jovanovic was its editor. Even if Jovanovic had a bone to pick with the Serbian government, Austria, and Turkey, the Slovenski Jug newspaper successfully advocated for its positive vision. It won support from the intellectual community and had considerable influence on Serbian society. They considered the unification of Yugoslavia to be in exactly the same tradition as that of Germany and Italy. Since Piedmont's unification of Italy was preceded by a period of internal regeneration, Jovanovic believed that Serbia must have a period of regeneration before it united the South Slavs. Even though Jovanovic was an avowed Republican, he did not oppose the Serbian monarchy so long as it continued its free speech reforms and held free elections. Between 1904 and 1906, Jovanovic attended most Yugoslav conferences in Belgrade. Because of the activism and work of the all-Yugoslav intellectuals, the Velika Škola was upgraded to Belgrade University by the government. After that point, Croats and Bulgarians studied at Belgrade University in large numbers, which helped in forming the national consciousness necessary for unification. Jovanovic opposed the Serbian Prime Minister Nikola Pasic because Pasic wasn't doing enough to fight alcoholism, encourage gymnastics, expand the army, and increase literacy. In fact, in 1910 it was estimated that it would take Serbia Serbia 240 years to reach universal literacy. Pasic was a Russophile, while Jovanovic was very skeptical of Russia because it was an autocracy. In other words, Pasic wasn't helping to facilitate Serbia's national revival. Opposition to Nikola Pasic's radical party came from a well-thought-out doctrine that Jovanovic believed would unite the South Slavs. Just because Pasic was generally working towards the expansion of Serbia, it didn't mean that Jovanovic considered having Pasic in office to be a victory. Jovanovic was able to define himself and his goals outside of the broad objective of defeating Turkey and Austria. Another conflict stemming from Jovanovic's genuine convictions was over Macedonia. The all Yugoslavs believed that Macedonia should have more autonomy in Turkey than that it be annexed by either Serbia or Bulgaria. Greater Serbian newspapers such as Politika and Pravda attacked Slovenski Jug, saying that Macedonia was Serbian and should belong to Serbia. In 1907, Slovenski Jug was split up and its newspaper suspended publication after an Austrian spy had infiltrated it. But Slovenski Jug was only the first chapter in the formation of Jovanovic's ideology and doctrine. Jovanovic's position on Macedonia and on Nikola Pasic were issues contingent to an overall objective. That is to say, the overall objective informed Jovanovic's opinions on those contingent issues. On the dissident right today, contingent issues take up the majority of discourse. Can there be a Muslim-Christian alliance? Is populism good or bad? Can we ally of Zionists to achieve domestic victories? Is Russia our friend or our enemy? What should our relationship with the Catholic Church be? To what extent can we play different factions of the left off of each other? All these questions will be answered easily by starting from a well-defined ideological position concerning the values and principles of one's own political organization. Here, I will focus on one issue, that is, are the Eurasian powers of Russia, Iran, and China friends or enemies? This might seem unrelated, but it's not, I swear. The enemies of Serbia were clear: Turkey and Austria. But if Turkey and Austria were expansionist powers who occupied Serbian lands, Italy also had designs on Dalmatia, lands considered integral to the South Slavs. Between 1905 and 1906, Italy was trying to court Serbia. However, Nikola Pasic saw right through this. Quote, Pasic was no fool. He was not unaware of the fact that Italy's opposition to Austro-Hungarian expansion in the Balkans sprang only from the fact that Italy had no share in it. It was likely that in supporting Serbo-Bulgarian understanding, Italy wished to force Austria into an agreement at the expense of the Balkan states. On one occasion, when he was angered by Italian claims of certain Macedonian districts for the Albanians, Pasic cried out, "By God, we shall fight anyone who attempts to take those lands, even if it be our brother by birth." If our struggle with Austria is a difficult one, it will not be so difficult with the Italians. Let Italy know that when the time comes for dividing us and breaking the Balkan Peninsula to pieces, we shall prefer to be swallowed up by Austria rather than by any other country. Page 151, Serbia between East and West. Wayne S. Vucinic. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. Pasic must have really hated Italians. If you read beyond this citation, the bit about wanting to be annexed by Austria is more of a joke. Of course, Pasic did not want Serbia to be annexed by anyone. However, Italy fought alongside Serbia in World War I, and in so doing, helped establish Yugoslavia. Russia and China occupy a similar position. It would take an entire essay to fully elaborate my position on Russia and China. Not because my position is complex or nuanced, but I would need to fully explain myself so as not to be accused of being a shill for Putin by one side and a neocon by the other. However, I need to say that I am totally against the continued existence of the United States, as seen by pretty much every video I've ever made. From the Death to America position, henceforth abbreviated as D2A, whenever the US takes a loss, whether it be inflicted internally or by foreign powers, that is a little triumph for D2A. Russia and China may be enemies, but nowhere on the same level as the US. Woodrow Wilson destroyed monarchy, FDR destroyed the European rebirth, the CIA poisoned European culture, as explained by Evola, and also by the book The Cultural Cold War, which I recommend everyone read. The fact that the United States is their arch enemy is habitual and eternal, and it will never ever change. However, there is opposition to D2A. Some dissident roidoids say that China is a greater threat because they traffic fentanyl. The people who say this are usually mega cultists like Patrick Casey, who is not beating the "he eats grubs off the forest floor" allegations. I really do believe that the Eurasian powers are enemies, but they are completely eclipsed by the United States in priority. Similarly, Italy had designs on the Balkans, but for obvious reasons, Serbians focused on Turkey and Austria first. What I am saying is that the US is our Austria and China is our Italy. One is so much more pressing than the other, but I only believe that because my foundation is super reactionary ultramonarchism. For those on the dissident right who do not see it that way, some might be American nationalists or crypto liberals or just generally pro-Western, but many others do not have such a foundation at all, so all they see are enemies without any clear sequence and how to engage them. They will say that the global American empire is an enemy, but so is China, so we must focus on them equally. For me, there's no equality here. The United States has basically ruined all European peoples for generations, while China is responsible for very recent and very solvable problems. For example, every country in the world that isn't a failed state has a secure border. To fix fentanyl trafficking would take less than a year. Or, with regards to real estate and political infiltration by the CCP, again, serious countries that are much closer to China and which China would have a stronger strategic interest in infiltrating, like Japan, have no issues with CCP infiltration. To solve political infiltration and China buying real estate would take 2 or 3 months, but it would require Canada to be a serious country first. To fix the damage done to Europeans by America would take some generations. China and Russia aren't friends, but if they go against the US, then on this issue alone, they can be useful. If you disagree with my analysis, that's fine. I have elaborated D2A in other videos. In this video, I will not elaborate on it because that isn't really the point I'm trying to make here. Patrick Casey might accuse me of purity spiraling, but for one, I don't eat grubs off the forest floor, and two, imagine that you were a communist living in the 1960s. Since 1945, all governments in the West, except France because of Charles de Gaulle, were moving in a left-wing direction. If I were a communist in Canada, wouldn't I have been happy that Pierre Trudeau got elected in 1968? After all, Pierre Trudeau was a Marxist in his youth and enacted a lot of left-wing policies in Canada. It's possible to say that these were victories for communists, but at the end of the day, we do not have a proletarian dictatorship. We know what communism looks like in the Soviet Union and China and Cuba and in North Korea. No Western government is communist, despite what some ignorant and frenzied center-right conservatives would have you believe. Canada is still ruled by a financial cabal, the same financial cabal that has been ruling Canada for 100 years. No matter how left-wing or right-wing the regime moves, we still live in a liberal regime. Communists have not succeeded in turning any Western democracy communist, despite Western democracies moving in that direction for 80 years. If communists have failed, what do you think Trump moving the regime in a rightward direction will accomplish? If there's no formal and complete change in the government that rules over us to an autocratic monarchy or to some other anti-democratic, nationalist, or theocratic government, then nothing has actually changed. Trump can sign 1,000 executive orders and return the US to a state before the Civil Rights Act, but we will still be ruled by a class of financiers guided by a liberal and democratic ideology. Wanting a complete turnover of the state isn't perfectionism or purity spiraling, as if electing a certain populist politician here and there are small steps in accomplishing an overall plan. Victory is a definitive outcome. Countries in war may celebrate victory in one battle, but understand that there will eventually be a conclusion. The victory that any serious person is looking for is a comprehensive change so complete and total that there would be no legal continuity with the preceding government. That people like Patrick Casey celebrate the new civic nationalist occupation government of 2025 shows how they lack a comprehensive vision, a clear set of goals, and a central idea around which they orient themselves, so that they consider any small gain to be a victory, or at least baby steps towards a favorable conclusion, like Austria occupying Mount Sur in Serbia before being kicked out. Did you like that transition to talking about Serbia again? I'm a very smart writer. Macedonia was under Turkish rule until 1912, but before 1912, Serbia and Bulgaria were both running a secret guerrilla war in Macedonia to influence and eventually take all of it for themselves. This guerrilla war wasn't minor. Notably, the 1903 Linden Uprising took and held land in Macedonia, and the revolutionaries actually formed their own government called the Kruševo Republic. It was put down by the Ottomans in 10 days. For me, it's impressive either way. 1903 was an eventful year for Serbia too, as in May, the ruling house of Obrenović was couped by rogue officers in the Serbian army who installed the rival house of Karađorđević. The officer conspirators were unanimously Serbian nationalists and irredentists, and with the influence that they had just won in their coup d'etat, began to orchestrate guerrilla operations in Macedonia. Their operations turned out to be extremely successful. Before the Linden Uprising, the majority of partisan action in Macedonia was Bulgarian-led, but since the Bulgarians had recently been defeated, there was a power vacuum. By 1905, Serbian revolutionaries in Macedonia comprised a small but professional army. A large part of this unofficial army was created in guerrilla training camps inside Serbia, which the Serbian government knew about and indirectly funded. For coordination of the guerrillas, a committee was set up in Skopje. On this committee were some future members of the Black Hand, like Dragutin Apis Dimitrijević, Lubomir Volović, and Bogdan Radenković. I'm having a lot of fun saying Serbian names. However, the Serbian government began to relax its secret war in Macedonia. This relaxation devastated the Macedonian Serbs, as Turks and Bulgarians quickly overturned their gains. Macedonian Serbs were once again being terrorized by Albanians. The deterioration of the Macedonian front coincided with Austria's annexation of Bosnia, an integral territory for Serbian nationalists. In 1908, Serbia had taken two major defeats on the two fronts that it actually had any influence in. It is in this background that two Serbian nationalist organizations were created, the Narodna Odbrana and the Black Hand. Both organizations were, at various points, in conflict with the Serbian government and were always in conflict with Austria-Hungary. They were dissidents. Therefore, it is totally not presumptuous or ignorant to compare the Black Hands to what is commonly called the dissident right. However, it must be said that because of certain connections within the Black Hand between 1911 and 1912, it was essentially an instrument of the Serbian Foreign Ministry and secretly formed the alliance between Serbia and Bulgaria. In this way, there is also a similarity, as some parts of the dissident right are more or less agents of the American oligarch Peter Thiel. The Black Hand was either conceived of by Bogdan Radenković in response to Serbia's inaction in Macedonia, or by Apis because he believed that infiltrating Narodna Odbrana was impractical. In any case, the formation of a group that explicitly advocated for what they believed in was the way forward, not hiding their beliefs as they infiltrated some organization or party. The Black Hand was initially envisioned as a mass popular organization. However, it turned out to be a smaller organization, but one which had more influential members. For example, 5 of the 7 founding members of the Black Hand were officers in the Serbian army. It's good to note that being part of a conspiracy is basically illegal and most of the time punishable by death in every army of the past and present. A cult of secrecy surrounded the Black Hand. In fact, the name Black Hand was a nickname. Its real name was Ujedinjenje ili Smrt, unification or death in English. This name was only revealed when Apis was arrested in 1916 and the Black Hand's constitution was seized. When you compare the Black Hands to other revolutionary groups like the Carbonari or the Bolsheviks, its record is not impressive. The Black Hand existed from 1911 to 1917, and its notable accomplishments are the alliance between Bulgaria and Serbia, guerrilla warfare in Macedonia, running an influential newspaper, smuggling weapons into Bosnia, and maybe assassinating Franz Ferdinand, but I'll cover that later. And it's also important to say that the Black Hand never wanted to overthrow the Serbian government. Most of their activities were conducted in Turkey and Austria. But I think it's useful to study the Black Hand because it's an example of an organization that adapted to the pressures that the state put on it. In the essay, Evola says that it can be beneficial for us if more restrictions are put on speech or activism. It will create a need for secrecy that doesn't currently exist. Increased censorship would also diminish the presence of polemics on the right and encourage the development of ideology. The state oppressing us isn't good in itself. I'm not an accelerationist. It's only that it may form the good habits that are necessary for victory. Ideally, we would form these good habits on our own, but in order to make a good soldier, they have to go through a period of indoctrination and disciplining. If the state is not oppressing dissidents, it's likely trying to integrate the less extreme elements of a dissident movement so that it can pacify it. A lack of necessary cohesiveness and discipline in dissident groups means that they can be easily placated and dissolved. For example, social democrats in the German Empire were placated by welfare programs so that socialism never developed the momentum behind it to take over Germany. By the time there were socialist revolts in 1918 and 1919, they failed to win great support from the German population. As for an example of a government that made no effort to placate its dissidents, Serbian nationalist coup the Obrenović dynasty in 1903, precisely because that regime pursued a policy of completely isolating its opponents. In the end, there were more people alienated from the monarchy than the monarchy had friends. The Russian Empire took harsh measures against the Bolsheviks so that many Bolsheviks, including Lenin and Stalin, lived in exile for years and focused on their doctrine instead of street activism and polemics. Similarly, from 1907 to 1910, Lubomir Jovanović studied abroad in Brussels, focusing on German nationalism, patriotic clubs, and European secret societies such as the Fragonards and Carbonari. Jovanović had a period of dedicated preparation, like every other successful revolutionary. When Jovanović was writing the Constitution of the Black Hand, he was inspired by the constitutions of other secret nationalist revolutionary societies, as well as the writings of other revolutionaries such as the Russian anarcho-communist Sergei Nechayev and his manifesto, Catechism of a Revolutionary. The Constitution of the Black Hand had 37 articles, and you can read all of them online. The majority of the articles deal with practical and organizational doctrine, but the first two deal with the aims of the Black Hand. Of the practical doctrines, Article 30 is something that should be emulated at all times. It states that, quote, on entering into the organization, every member must know that by joining the organization, he loses his own personal identity. He must not expect any glory for himself, nor any personal benefit, material or moral. The induction ritual and organizational methods of the Black Hand were inspired by the French conspirator Philippe Buonarroti and the Freemasons. A member described how Jovanović had initiated him, ushered into a darkened room where a member lit a candle, revealing on a table a cross and a revolver. He was told to sign his name in blood under the text of the society's oath. These are some practices that serious dissident organizations adopt. For theory, the beliefs of the Black Hand were articulated through its unofficial newspaper. In 1911, the newspaper Piedmont was founded by Jovanović. Its purpose was very similar to Slovenski Jug. Quote, Piedmont's first issue of 21st August 1911 presented Ujedinjenje's and Jovanović's public program. More elaborate and less idealistic than that of Slovenski Jug, it emphasized the necessity for a centralized state and a strong army. Denouncing existing Serbian political parties for immorality and deficient patriotism, Jovanović urged that able and dedicated men create a wholly new political organization. In Serbia, it would regenerate the people physically, improve sanitary conditions, combat chronic diseases and alcoholism, encourage gymnastics, reform primary and secondary schools under state direction, and foster vocational training, intensify roadwork and railroad construction, collect more taxes from the economically strong, increase defense expenditures, encourage the cult of the state, and foster the prestige of the ruler, the administration, and the National Assembly. The name Piedmont is a reference to Italian unification, where Piedmont was the kingdom that led it. In parallel, they believed that Serbia would be the Piedmont of the South Slavs. At this point, Jovanović was very educated and often had the lead article in Piedmont. He always drew parallels between Serbian unification and German and Italian unification. A writer for Piedmont, S.M. Radovanović, said that political clubs at Belgrade University abandoned partisan polemics for cooperative work for the national cause because of Jovanović's influence. Even though the Black Hand was broadly right-wing, they accepted anyone of any political leaning so long as they were looking for the unification of the South Slavs. For example, late in 1911, Jovanović met the Bosnian socialist Vladimir Gacinović, a leader of Young Bosnia. Milada Bosna and recruited him into the Black Hand. The writers of Piedmont consistently advocated for war against Turkey. When war actually did arrive in 1912, the writers of Piedmont laid down their pens and enlisted in the Serbian army. For the duration of the war, Piedmont suspended publication. I guess it's just shocking to see people who are not total hypocrites and actually put their lives on the line for what they believe in. As it turned out, Jovanovic died at the age of 36 from cholera while fighting in the Second Balkan War. Because Jovanovic was the strongest advocate for all Yugoslavism, his death meant that Serbian nationalists ended up dominating the Black Hand. After 1913, it would even be fair to say that the Black Hand became proto-fascist, as Piedmont started to militate against the parliamentary system and began to see Serbia as the only legitimate nation between Croatia, Bosnia, and Serbia. It's also after that point that they began to call Nikola Pasic and his radical party traitors to the nation. Because of this increase in devotion on the part of these Serbian patriots, the Serbian ruling class started to consider them as enemies of the state. Although, there wouldn't be time to start oppressing and censoring them as World War I broke out. After Princip's attempt on the Archduke, most Serbian newspapers condemned the attack. Only the Piedmont called Princip a young martyr and wrote that the real culprits were the Austrians themselves, who had provoked the murder by creating an insufferable state of affairs in Bosnia. Page 155, Sarajevo, The Story of a Political Murder, Joachim Remak. Princip was not part of the Black Hand. He actually went to Belgrade and wanted to become a member, but he had been told that they were not accepting more members. And despite that, Gavrilo Princip and the other assassins received arms and training from the Black Hand member Vojislav Tankisic, and then were helped in secretly crossing the Austrian border and were given a safe house to stay in. However, the leadership of the Black Hand generally opposed any attempt against Franz Ferdinand. The de facto leader, Apis, said that he even held a meeting before the assassination, and all members of the Black Hand present, except Tankisic, agreed to urgently recall the assassins. Whether they acted too late, or if the assassins refused to obey them, remains uncertain. But there's skepticism over this version of events because it contradicts other statements by Apis saying that the Black Hand's Central Executive Committee was no longer meeting. In any case, the attempt was carried out, and those most dedicated to their national cause stood by Princip because he was their brother and kin in the struggle for what they called their liberation. It goes without saying that what Princip did was wrong, and a big no-no. However, that Piedmont supported Princip shows how strong their moral unity was. And before I talk about the modern dissident right again, the issue is not that there isn't unity. If you're familiar with the online right at all, you will know that different groups in the same sphere probably hate each other more than they hate what should be their enemies. Instead, I believe the problem here is the lack of a central and defining idea. I say this exactly to make everyone indignant against me. Dissident rightoids are generally stubborn, their views restrained, and unimaginative. It's not that there's pushback whenever someone tries to articulate a positive vision, it's that there is not an appetite for radical change among those who compose the dissident right. In other words, I, as a right revolutionary, am serving a seafood dish to people who are allergic to seafood, and to Patrick Casey, who only eats grubs off the forest floor. The great majority of rightoids, most of whom are on Twitter, want to live a bourgeois and middle-class life. There's nothing aspirational or even desirable about having a sterile marriage, having 2.5 kids, and living in a car-dependent suburb. It is a conception of life that is entirely liberal and mercantile, manufactured by a liberal and mercantile state. This bourgeois life, which came from the US and which conservatives in the US crave, is not at all traditional, and it fails at perpetuating the nation. If you want an example of a real traditional life, Maurice Duplessis did it so well that the CIA gave him a cerebral congestion. And Gavrilo Princip was an impoverished student who had literally nothing, so a complete change in the system wouldn't matter to him. He had a real appetite for change. But this isn't to say that a revolutionary attitude is only formed in poverty. All of the leaders of the Black Hand were willing to put their lives on the line for their national cause. Many of them were in the army, and those who weren't, like Jovanovic, volunteered to fight once war came. Education about our national cause in Canada can inspire equal dedication. Only men like Apis and Princip can advance our national cause, idealists who seek no personal advantage and are devoted to national interests. Desperate Serbian nationalists formed the Black Hand as they struggled against what they perceived to be the cleansing of Serbians in Macedonia and Bosnia. They were fighting against the oppressors of their kin. The bootlicking, status-obsessed, collaborationist, fake right-wing opposition, self-proclaimed white advocates on Twitter are not desperate, they're exhausted. They aren't fighting bayonet and calloused hand against their oppressors. In fact, people like Patrick Casey and John Doyle are open collaborationists because they think they can get something in return. Today, we rightists who care about our kin are trying to liberate ourselves from a Republican empire centered in Washington, D.C. The only attitude we should have towards our oppressors is to do away with them. Any cooperation with establishment conservatives, Zionists, financiers, and billionaire oligarchs should mark you as an enemy. It is similar to if a Serbian collaborated with Austria-Hungary. There is no chance that Austria would ever give up Bosnia. There is no chance that the United States will ever allow us to control our destiny. By the way, when I say bayonet and calloused hand, I'm not encouraging direct action. I'm just saying that the attitude that should be adopted is one of total defiance. Patrick Casey is like a Stasi agent working for communism. His work as an activist is not to advance the interest of Europeans, but to legitimate the rule of our oppressors. Patrick Casey used to run Minecraft live streams that were so boring that literally nobody watched them. Patrick Casey is so unlikable that the American Identity Movement disbanded, so nobody would have to talk to him again. Patrick Casey is so incompetent that he ran a Discord server and all its messages were leaked by Antifa. Patrick Casey was at a Sovereign House party and Curtis Yarvin offered him boiled eggs, but Patrick Casey said, "No thank you, I only eat grubs off the forest floor." Anyways. This is a small intermission. 1. I'm still going to make the video about the Quiet Revolution. As you can see, I'm editing this video a lot less and I'm working with different equipment, so don't worry, I'm still gonna make it. 2. When making videos about history, it is just impossible to give every single detail. Whenever I make a video that includes historical information, I always feel a bit guilty because I don't give the complete picture. Even books, which are 700 pages long, leave out a lot of details, and you'll only get the full picture on any given topic by reading academic tomes that cost $200. Or they may be a different price if you sailed the 7 seas. I am covering the history of the Black Hand in this video, but if you want to know everything, I'm citing some books on screen. The book, Apis, The Congenital Conspirator, by David Mackenzie, was an incredible source. It is one of those academic books that covers one topic in all its details, that is, the life of Dragutin Dmitrievich. One day, I will make this video in French too, but you know, personal stuff in my life and all that. I'm sorry if you're a francophone, you're just gonna have to wait. And also, if you don't know, I have a French channel if you're a francophone and you speak French. 4th, unfortunately, I've made a new Twitter. The problem is, the entire user base of Fedi is comparable in size to a small village in Macedonia. So if YouTube ever decides to destroy me, that is everything I've ever done, lost in 1 second. Twitter is a secondary mass popular platform, but I will never ever use it to comment on the news, I promise. If you agree with what I have to say in this video, then you can just comment, quote, "Patrick Casey eats grubs off the forest floor." It will really help a lot, thank you. That the dissident right constantly fights with itself is not a symptom of fanatic belief in different positive visions or even purity spiraling. Instead, it is because of a lack of clarity. I can put it this way, when do we ever argue with progressives? Sure, there might be arguments here and there, just through random chance, but we never see the same crusades that are performed on the right. Like, the leader of the Mexican Americans, Fuentes, has never fought Haz Infrared, a communist, in the same way he has waged a propaganda war with Costin Alamoriu. The reason for this is that there is very little friction between groups that are diametrically opposed. Unless you're at work and you're forced to be of people you don't like, we tend to self-segregate. But someone who is very close to you that disagrees on specific issues can very easily look like a subversive. If everyone on the dissident right had different end goals, that is actually not a bad thing, because any agreement or coalition has to be between factions who know what they want. That a broad coalition currently doesn't exist on the right, and instead there is infighting, indicates that the lines between what should be different factions are blurred. Instead of everyone having a positive self-conception, there is a struggle to distinguish each each movement from every other movement because everyone has a problem with defining themselves from the start. Any person and any organization that has a positive self-conception doesn't need to engage in conflict to define itself because they already know who they are. Any lasting movement must have a positive self-conception so that if and when its enemies are no more, it continues to exist as a force for building, not only as a force for fighting. I may not like Zionists, but because of the fact that they exist beyond fighting their enemies, they are a force that will continue to exist. Until the day when Diocons meet their end, they will continue to influence the right because of their cohesiveness. The only way to solve this problem of a lack of definition is to define yourself, that is, to independently assert what you want. If I were to define my objective in the most simple terms, I want to create an autocracy in Canada. The majority of everyone, not only in the entire world, but also on the dissident right, will disagree with me. But that's okay. When advocating for a set of ideas, billions won't care, and even among the couple thousand who do care, the majority of them will disagree with you. And that's why I take disagreement with equanimity. All I can do is present myself in the most sincere and honest way possible. However I'm taken doesn't matter so long as I'm trying my best. Because of my ideology and dedication to Canada, it is impossible for me to build a coalition with the majority of everyone who would otherwise be on my side. And there's nothing wrong with that. For example, there are pan-Europeanists who want to build an intercontinental racial commune. I'm against such a pan-European project because it would homogenize all the different European nations. I just want to create a Canadian autocracy. Why should we cooperate? Our goals are entirely different. Pan-Europeanists aren't my enemies. It would be preferable to have them compared to the American Empire. But I find it hard to believe that factions with radically different positive visions could cooperate for any extended period of time without backstabbing each other. The aftermath of the Spanish Civil War is proof of that, I'm pretty sure. But let's say that we did ignore these differences, that we all coalesced around a single movement with a broad objective. Is there any historical precedent for this? Yes. Yugoslavia, but only Yugoslavia under the House of Karađorđević. Even if the Black Hand was destroyed in 1916 by the Salonika trial, the goal of the Black Hand was achieved in 1918, the unification of the South Slavs, or at least 90% of them and not Bulgaria. But the regime that came to rule Yugoslavia did not have any intellectual foundation. The royal dictatorship of King Alexander had purged the Black Hand and then other factions that could have provided a better positive vision. In the end, King Alexander fell back on Serbian chauvinism, which alienated everyone who wasn't Serbian. So, Yugoslavia was achieved, but because it was formed without any core doctrine or ideology, it caused the Kingdom of Yugoslavia great trouble, including the assassination of King Alexander in 1934. I won't talk about communist Yugoslavia entirely because I've only read about Yugoslavia and Serbia pre-1934 and know very little about Yugoslavia post-World War II. But Yugoslavia isn't the only example of an unclarified doctrine leading to internal instability. The Nazis had a clear political doctrine, while Mussolini said, "Our program is simple, we want to govern Italy." Evola points out in The Trial of Air that Italy was worse off compared to Germany because of Mussolini's so-called political realism. Francoism and the Estado Novo have similarities here too. Francisco Franco came to power on the formula of defeating communism. Because of the lack of ideological doctrine from Franco's Spain, Francoism literally has no legacy. In comparison, Antonio Salazar's Estado Novo offers something to the Portuguese. Because of that, Salazar is still celebrated by many Portuguese. There was a poll ran by a Portuguese public broadcaster in 2007 to see who the greatest Portuguese of all time was. Salazar won 41% of the vote, although the authenticity of that result is questionable because of the polling method used. But another poll placed Salazar as number 7. Pure political doctrine is necessary to have a coherent vision and strategy. The absence of doctrine leads to poor leadership and ill-defined objectives. Having no intellectual center is like having an army without officers or a traveler without a map. Currently, all the actions and propagandizing that the dissident right takes and does has no greater meaning. They are aimless thrusts against the enemy with no concentration on a systematic victory or defeat in detail, which would be so valuable for a smaller force going against a larger one. In order for the right to define itself properly, it must have its base in universal tradition. The left-wing worldview wasn't obvious. Before the American Revolution, the traditional worldview was the default for everyone. It needed no elaboration. The left developed powerful ideological weapons to get the upper hand. The left won, not because they were more correct, effect, but because the right had no equivalent tools. In order for the right to re-establish itself, it needs to develop political weapons. We suffer from a centuries-old theoretical, strategic, tactical, and practical lag. What is called the right wing is just a normal, sensible, and centered position for humanity. For this reason, the future belongs to the right. Not only that, but Canada is the future too. With political figures in the US, you don't know if they're in politics because of money or if they have a genuine conviction. This is because there is a lot of money to be made in United Station politics. It's not uncommon for foreigners, like Canadians, to make the American market their base. For someone on the right, if you stand with Canada and against the US, you have very little to gain. But it is precisely this that makes Canada the future. All political movements in the US have been infiltrated by actors who wish to use them for their own personal advantage. Canadian rightists, who I won't name, but you know who you are, exist because they have the courage of their convictions. The rightist movement in Canada is more genuinely motivated than anything American. Selfless idealists who still have a genuine attachment to Canada will be willing to commit to great sacrifice in the future. This sacrifice will be in service of an authentic and pure political idea. Authentic because it is uniquely Canadian, and pure because it is not motivated by any material concern. This is a last-minute addition, if you know what I mean. Nobody becomes a faithful partisan through poverty. Like, very few people in Canada have actually moved away from consensus beliefs, even though we're becoming more poor every single day that passes. Gavrilo Princip did live in poverty, but Princip was also probably more well-read than most online politics commentators today. Princip read a lot of Serbian nationalist literature and other political stuff, if you know what I mean. So he became a dedicated patriot through what was essentially revolutionary education. Being in poverty didn't instill fidelity in him. It was education. I just have a little small story to share before I reach the conclusion. I was doing my weekly, regular, and boring shopping at Walmart. I live in a rural area, like in the middle of nowhere in the Ozarks, so there's a little patch of woods next to the Walmart parking lot. So I bought my stuff, and as I was exiting, I saw a man coming out of the woods, and I couldn't believe my eyes. I said to myself, "Is that Patrick Casey?" But he came closer. I saw that he was wearing a crown of tongues. The tongues had a string going for the length of them so that their tips were touching their ends in a circle, and on the tongues, tags were attached, each with a name: Dasha Nekrasova, Anna Katshian, Ava Vlardingerbrook, Peachy Keenan, Hollow Earth Turf, and so on. A brownish-green substance thickly coated his maw, and it was sort of dripping on the ground, but in chunks. And what I realized was that Patrick Casey eats grubs off the forest floor. This video is dedicated to the brave Chetnik fighters of Serbia. In no way am I encouraging direct action. Today's struggle has obviously taken a different form compared to the struggles of yesterday. If I were to focus on the Natsoks, their movement would be more comparable to today, but there would still be a lot of differences. In any case, there are a lot of commentators in our sphere that are either conflict avoidant or of a general aversion to what they call radicalism. It is often said that we, in fact, do not want the collapse of the United States because of the suffering it would inflict on the nations and peoples of the US, which are held prisoner by Washington, D.C. We do not want the suffering of our kin. Any general collapse or worsening of conditions would not help us. However, it wouldn't be a bad thing either. Whatever happens will happen. Whether or not the United States will enter a Russian-style civil war is something completely beyond our control. The only thing we do control at the moment is our own sphere. We can build fraternal networks and cultural organizations like Slovensky Yug. This is already happening as certain real-life political organizations are taking shape in Canada. This is legitimate action. Through this action, we already control our fate. If the power structures oppressing us were to fall, it will cause suffering, but it will also create a power vacuum which may or may not be filled by us. And the only way to ensure that it is filled by us is if we put in the work today to see ourselves come to power tomorrow. Of course, there are other means to come to power aside from a Soviet-style collapse, but our actions right now are not meaningless or useless. Like a good army, I only hope that we are prepared for all eventualities. Between the Serbian nationalists, the Natsoks, and us, the fundamentals remain the same. We are travelers and we need a map. We are an army and we need officers. A comprehensive theoretical and practical political doctrine is the guide for all successful action.